The marble floors of the Villa Rustica gleamed with something darker than water that autumn morning in 73 BCE, something that seeped between the tessellated tiles, pooling in the grout lines like ink. The household slaves moved through their duties with eyes cast downward, their sandals leaving rust-colored prints as they hurried past the atrium where Domina Aelia sat, her fingers working methodically through a scroll she wasn't reading. She was listening for the sound that had stopped an hour before dawn, the sound of screaming from the slave quarters behind the villa's eastern wall. In the storeroom where amphorae of wine stood sentinel in the shadows, a young woman named Prisca lay motionless on a bed of straw that had turned the color of poppies. Her eyes stared at nothing. Her belly, swollen with 7 months of unwanted life, rose and fell with shallow breaths. Around her wrists were the marks of iron shackles, and around her ankles, something worse, the deep bruising that comes from being held down. But it wasn't the bruising that made the other slaves turn away when they brought her water. It was what the master had ordered done to her the night before, when she'd been caught trying to induce her own miscarriage with pennyroyal and rue. This is a story about power. About what happens when human beings are reduced to property, and when that property has the audacity to grow life inside it. This is about Rome. Not the Rome of marble temples and triumphant generals, but the Rome that existed in the shadows of those monuments, where the foundation of civilization was built on the broken bodies of the forgotten. If you want to journey deeper into the darkest corners of history, follow the wicked historian. We don't just tell you what happened, we make you feel what it was like to be there. To understand what happened to women like Prisca, you must first understand the machinery of Roman slavery itself, a system so vast, so entrenched in every aspect of daily life, that the Romans themselves could not imagine their world without it. By the late Republic, nearly 1 in 3 people in Italy was enslaved. They were the invisible engine of Roman prosperity, the human fuel that powered the bathhouses and bakeries, the farms and forges, the pleasure houses and private homes. But pregnant slaves occupied a particularly precarious position in this hierarchy of suffering. They represented a paradox that made Roman masters uneasy. They were both valuable and threatening, assets and liabilities, future profit and present inconvenience. The streets of Rome in the 1st century BCE were an assault on the senses. The acrid smell of fuller's urine used to clean togas mixed with the heavy sweetness of incense from the temples, the cacophony of metal striking metal in the workshops, the shouts of merchants hawking garum and honeyed wine, the rumble of carts on cobblestones. All of it created a constant wall of sound that made private suffering invisible. A pregnant slave could be beaten bloody in an alleyway, and the city would simply flow around the violence like water around a stone. The law was clear, brutally so. Under Roman law, slaves were res mancipi, things to be owned, like livestock or land. They had no legal personhood, no rights to their own bodies, no claim to their children. The paterfamilias, the male head of household, held power of life and death over his slaves. This was called dominica potestas, and it was absolute. A master could kill a slave with impunity until the reign of Emperor Hadrian, and even then, the penalties were negligible, more concerned with waste of property than with murder. For a pregnant slave, this meant that the child growing inside her belonged to her master from the moment of conception. The fetus was property before it was born. And if a master decided that this particular piece of property was inconvenient, if the pregnancy would interfere with the woman's labor, if feeding another mouth seemed wasteful, if the father was unknown or undesirable, he had options, terrible options. Let me take you inside a typical Roman household of means, the kind where most urban slaves lived and worked. The house itself was a maze of hierarchies made physical. At the front, the atrium with its impluvium pool, where clients came to pay respects and business was conducted. Behind that, the tablinum where the master kept his records. Further back, the peristyle garden, a pocket of carefully cultivated nature surrounded by columns. And then, always at the rear, always separated by walls or distance, the slave quarters. These were dim, narrow rooms, often underground or tucked into spaces too small or too poorly ventilated for the free inhabitants. A pregnant slave might share a room the size of a closet with 6 other women, sleeping on straw or bare earth, rising before dawn and retiring after the household was settled. Privacy was a concept that didn't apply to her. Dignity was not a consideration. When a slave woman realized she was pregnant, she faced an immediate calculation. Would the master be pleased? If the father was another valuable slave, a strong field hand, a skilled artisan, the child might be seen as an investment. But if the pregnancy resulted from rape by the master himself, or by his sons, or by a guest, the calculation became darker. An educated slave, a body slave, a woman trained in music or languages, her value lay in her ability to serve, not to breed. Pregnancy made her temporarily useless, and Rome had little patience for uselessness. Some masters employed a villicus, an overseer, to manage their slave households. These men, often freed slaves themselves, had learned to navigate Roman cruelty with a survivor's ruthlessness. They were the ones who administered the punishments, who made the decisions about which slaves ate and which went hungry, who could rest and who must work until they collapsed. For a pregnant slave woman who had displeased her master, the villicus became the instrument of her torment. The punishments began with labor, forced, relentless, physically impossible labor. While Roman medical writers like Soranus acknowledged that pregnant women required rest and care, these considerations evaporated when the woman was property. A pregnant slave might be forced to work the mills, pushing the heavy grinding stones in circles for hours, the weight of the stone and the weight of her belly combining to compress her spine. Or she might be sent to work the fields during harvest, bending and cutting grain in the blistering sun, her swollen feet turning the soil to mud with her blood. The logic was simple and savage. Work her until the pregnancy ends itself, one way or another. Then there were the beatings. The flagellum, a whip with multiple leather thongs, sometimes weighted with metal or bone, was the standard instrument of slave discipline. But for pregnant women, the application was strategically refined. Some masters ordered the woman tied to a post, belly exposed, and struck across the abdomen with calculated precision. Not to kill, that would be waste, but to cause maximum pain and perhaps to dislodge the fetus. The slave would be left there often for hours, as an example to the others. The message was clear. Your body is not yours. What grows inside you is not yours. Everything you are belongs to us. In some households, particularly cruel masters devised a punishment called the furca. A heavy wooden fork was fastened around the woman's neck, with her arms tied to the crossbeam. She would be paraded through the house or even through the streets, forced to announce her transgression, perhaps that she had tried to rest, or had requested lighter duties, or had the temerity to ask for better food. The weight of the furca would bear down on her shoulders and neck, making breathing difficult. For a pregnant woman, already struggling with the burden of her condition, this could be agonizing, even lethal. But perhaps nothing was more psychologically devastating than the practice of forced abortion through physical trauma. This wasn't medicine. This was torture disguised as property management. A pregnant slave who was deemed too troublesome or whose child was unwanted might be subjected to systematic violence designed to terminate the pregnancy. Kicks to the abdomen, punches to the lower back, being thrown downstairs, being forced to lift impossible weights. The Romans had observed that such traumas could cause miscarriage, and some masters employed these methods with clinical detachment. And if the woman survived, if she somehow carried the child to term despite everything, there was always the threat of what would come after. The child could be sold away immediately or exposed to die on a hillside, a common Roman practice for disposing of unwanted infants. The mother would be given no time to recover, no moment to grieve before being put back to work or sold herself. Let us return to Prisca. lying in that storeroom, her life draining into the straw. She had been born into slavery on a latifundium in Campania, one of the vast agricultural estates that fed Rome's appetite. Her mother had been a field slave, her father unknown, perhaps the villicus, perhaps a passing soldier, perhaps another slave. It didn't matter. She was property from her first breath. At 12, she was sold to a merchant who brought her to Rome, where she was trained as a body slave, learning to dress hair and prepare cosmetics, to speak Greek and play the lyre. She had value, she had skills. And then, at 17, her master's son took an interest. There was no courtship, no possibility of refusal. He came to her sleeping alcove one night, and 9 months later, her first child was born. A girl who was sold 3 days after birth to cover a gambling debt. Prisca never learned her name. The second pregnancy came 2 years later. This time, she knew what awaited her. She had seen other slave women in the household, their haunted eyes, their empty arms. She had heard the sounds from the slave quarters when infants were carried away, and so she made a decision that in the free world would have been hers alone. But in her world was unthinkable rebellion. She would end the pregnancy herself. The herbs grew in the garden she tended. Pennyroyal with its tiny purple flowers. Rue, bitter and pungent. She knew the dosages from whispered conversations with older women. Knowledge passed down like a secret spell. She made a tea one evening after her duties, drank it in the shadows near the household shrine, and prayed not to the family's protective gods, but to whatever dark power might grant a slave mercy. The cramping started within an hour. By midnight, she was hemorrhaging. By dawn, she was discovered. The master's rage was not about morality or the sanctity of life. Those were concepts reserved for citizens, for people. His rage was economic. She had attempted to destroy his property. The child she carried belonged to him, and she had tried to steal it through the only act of autonomy available to her. The punishment was decided quickly. She would be made an example. They shackled her first, though she was already too weak to fight. Then they brought the flagellum. The beating was administered by the villicus in the atrium, where every slave in the household was forced to watch. 20 lashes across her back, 20 lashes across her legs. And then, as she slumped in her chains, 10 deliberate strikes across her swollen belly. The baby stopped moving that afternoon. Prisca was dragged to the storeroom and left there, not dead, but not exactly alive either. The household physician, a Greek slave named Demetrios, who had sewn wounds and set bones for years, was not summoned. This was not an injury to be treated. This was a lesson in progress. The other slaves in the household moved through the day after Prisca's punishment with a particular kind of silence. This wasn't the absence of sound. The house was still full of the usual noises, the grinding of mills, the splash of water, the murmur of conversation. This was the silence of people who had learned not to see, not to feel, not to remember. To survive as a slave in Rome, you had to develop a kind of selective blindness, a way of witnessing horror without letting it destroy you. But in the storeroom, one person refused to look away. Her name was Maya, an older woman who had been in the household for 30 years. She had been born free in Germania, captured during a military campaign when she was 19, and sold south through a network of traders until she ended up in Rome. She had been pregnant twice in slavery. The first time, she miscarried after being kicked by a drunken overseer. The second time, she delivered a healthy boy who was sold at age 3 to a household in Ostia. She never saw him again. That had been 15 years ago, and she had learned since then to survive by becoming invisible, by making herself so quietly efficient that she was never noticed enough to be punished. But something about Prisca's situation cracked the armor she had built around her heart. That evening, when the household settled into its post-dinner routine, Maya slipped into the storeroom with a cup of watered wine and a piece of bread. Prisca's eyes were open, but unfocused. The bleeding had slowed, but her skin had taken on the waxy pallor of someone whose body was giving up. Maya knelt beside her and gently lifted her head, brought the cup to her lips. "Drink," she whispered in Germanic, their shared language of suffering. "If you can." Priska's lips moved, but no sound came out. After a moment, she managed a small sip, then another. Maya held her, one hand supporting her head, the other resting carefully on her shoulder. Touch as an act of rebellion, as a way of saying, "You are not alone. You are not nothing. You are still human, even if they have tried to beat the humanity out of you." "I'm sorry," Priska finally managed, her voice barely audible. "I just couldn't. Not again." Maya said nothing. What was there to say? That it would be all right. That was a lie. That she understood. Of course she understood. Every woman in these walls understood. Instead, she just held her, and for a few minutes in that dim room that smelled of wine and blood and despair, two slaves allowed themselves to be human. By morning, Priska was dead. The household physician noted the cause as hemorrhage following miscarriage in the estate's records. Her body was removed without ceremony and buried in the common pit outside the city walls where Rome disposed of its slaves, its criminals, its inconvenient dead. No marker, no ritual, no acknowledgement that a person had existed and suffered and died. The master ordered the storeroom cleaned and returned to use. Within a week, the stains were gone. Within a month, most of the household had forgotten. Only Maya remembered, carrying the weight of that memory like a stone in her chest, one more ghost added to the collection she carried with her through her days. But Priska's story was not unique. It was ordinary, heartbreakingly, horrifyingly ordinary. Across Rome's vast empire, in households from Britannia to Syria, from Hispania to Egypt, pregnant slave women faced similar calculations and similar punishments. The specifics might vary, but the underlying logic was always the same. Slaves were property, pregnancy was a property issue, and property that misbehaved or underperformed must be disciplined. Roman agricultural writers provided explicit guidance on the management of pregnant slaves. Columella, writing in the 1st century CE, advised that pregnant slave women should be given lighter duties and better rations, not out of compassion, but because it improved the survival rate of the children they carried, and healthy slave children were valuable. But he also noted that if a woman proved troublesome during pregnancy, she should be sold or put to harder labor to prevent laziness and insubordination from spreading to other slaves. The code of laws compiled by Justinian in the 6th century CE contained provisions about pregnant slaves, but these were purely economic regulations. If you injured someone else's pregnant slave and caused her to miscarry, you owed the owner compensation for the lost property. The value of the fetus, calculated based on the mother's worth and the probable value of the child. The woman herself was never considered in these calculations except as a container for future property. Some Roman philosophers, like Seneca, wrote about treating slaves with relative humanity, arguing that excessive cruelty was unbecoming of a civilized person. But even these more enlightened views never questioned the fundamental structure of slavery itself. The pregnant slave remained property, her body a vessel for her owner's economic interests, her suffering a matter of no legal or moral consequence. What makes the story of Rome's pregnant slave women particularly haunting is how thoroughly their experiences have been erased from historical memory. The ancient sources we have, the letters, the histories, the legal codes, were all written by and for the free, the powerful, the masters. Slaves appear in these texts as background figures, as economic units, as problems to be solved. Their voices, their perspectives, their pain, all of it exists, only in fragments and silences, in the gaps between the words of their owners. We know about the punishments I've described, not because anyone thought to record the slaves' experiences, but because masters sometimes mentioned them in passing, or because legal cases addressed property disputes, or because the occasional writer noted a particularly brutal incident as an example of someone else's cruelty. The suffering was so normalized, so mundane, that it often wasn't worth recording at all. When archaeologists excavate Roman sites, They occasionally find mass graves outside city walls, the common pits where slaves and criminals were buried without marker or ritual. Sometimes these remains show evidence of traumatic injuries, of broken bones that healed badly or didn't heal at all, of nutritional deficiencies, of lives lived in constant physical stress. Among these remains are the skeletons of young women, their pelvises showing signs of multiple pregnancies, their bones bearing the marks of violence. These are the only monuments Rome built for women like Prisca. Unmarked graves, anonymous bones, silence. The closing on certain winter nights in Rome, when the wind comes down from the hills and whistles through the ruins of ancient apartment buildings, when the city is caught between rain and something colder, you can almost hear them. The ghosts of all those forgotten women, the ones who labored and died in the shadows of marble monuments, the ones whose children were torn from their arms or who tore the pregnancies from their own bodies in desperate acts of autonomy. The ones who survived only by learning not to feel, not to hope, not to remember that they were once something more than property. Their names are gone, their faces are forgotten, but their suffering was real as the stones of the Forum, as real as the aqueducts that still carry water, as real as the Latin words that still echo through our legal systems and our languages. We built civilization on their broken bodies. We built our concepts of law and order, our notions of property and power, our entire understanding of what it means to have rights and freedoms on the foundation of their exploitation. And we did it so efficiently, so thoroughly, that we almost managed to erase them from history entirely. Almost, but not quite, because every now and then a story survives. A name appears in a record. A skeleton tells its tale of violence. And we are forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that the glory of Rome, its roads and temples, its literature and law, its entire magnificent civilization, was purchased with the agony of people like Prisca. People who were never allowed to be people. Women who were never allowed to be women. Mothers who were never allowed to be mothers. The punishments I've described were not aberrations. They were not the acts of a few cruel individuals. They were the system working exactly as it was designed to work, a machine of exploitation so efficient that it ran for centuries, grinding human beings into profit with the cold logic of property law. And perhaps the most chilling thing of all is this. When we look back at Rome, we still see the temples first. We see the triumphal arches, the mighty legions, the senators in their togas debating philosophy and law. We see the glory. We have to work much harder to see the blood. But it's there. It's always been there. Soaked into the marble floors of 10,000 villas, dried on the stones of forgotten slave quarters, marking the places where women like Prisca lay dying while the empire went on with its business. Too important and too powerful to notice one more broken body among the millions it consumed. Remember her name, Prisca. Remember that she existed. Remember that she tried to claim ownership of the one thing the law said she could never own, her own body. And remember that she died for it, in a storeroom, in the dark, while Rome slept peacefully above her, dreaming its dreams of eternal glory. The empire is gone now, reduced to ruins and tourist attractions. But the silence remains. The forgetting remains. And somewhere in that silence, in that forgetting, the ghosts of Rome's slave women are still waiting. Waiting for someone to remember. Waiting for someone to see. Waiting for their suffering to finally mean something. This is why we tell these stories, not to titillate or horrify, but to bear witness. To stand in the gap between history and oblivion and say, this happened, these were real people, their pain mattered, their lives mattered, and the fact that the empire tried to erase them makes it all the more important that we refuse to forget. So remember Prisca, remember Maya, remember all the nameless women who carried unwanted pregnancies through the streets of Rome, who felt their children move inside them and knew those children would never be theirs, who made impossible choices in impossible situations and were punished for daring to choose at all. Remember them, because if we don't, who will? The marble floors of Rome are clean now, scrubbed by centuries of rain and tourism. But on certain nights, in certain lights, you can still see the stains. You just have to know where to look. And you have to be willing to see what civilization tried so hard to hide. The blood was always there. The suffering was always there. The women were always there. We just weren't paying attention.